This empire of chivalrous knights kept their devotion to God all throughout their travels to the Holy Land, a betrayal by their very own Judas, wars to defend the faith from heathen neighbors, and a final triumph over the Antichrist. No, this is not some epic born from Crusader Kings 3 or Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven. It all played out in real time on a little Minecraft server. Together, a few dozen ordinary gamers, like you and me, created their very own tight community of friends from the comfort of their homes, pushing on through wars and cosmic tribulations to build a sacred kingdom that shines bright in the annals of Minecraft history. So grab some coffee and maybe a snack. For today, we're going through the Chronicles of the Crusader Kingdom in the Minecraft world of Abexilas. You can visit the Crusaders or make your very own nation by joining this Minecraft server right now at the IP play.stoneworks.gg. And if you want to see the Crusader capital city, meet its players, and everything else in this video, just hop on to Abexilas and do the command /LA spawn Crusadon. In the beginning, a few players with dreams of establishing a kingdom attempted to do so on the old world of Rathnir, building an artificial island squatting in the seas of an empire called Lunaris. But Lunaris' massive army came in and swiftly crushed them and drove them out. But the divine mission of the Crusaders would not be halted so easily. The old worlds of Rathnir and Eldom would eventually come to an end, freezing with the coming of an apocalyptic world war under a passing comet, which carried the migrating souls to a brand new land called Abexilas. The players underwent a period of mapping their new home and setting up sporadic settlements of small tribal nations. The world map was splotchy and ever-changing, as different player groups jostled for small sections of land and attempted to gain the best resources and strategic areas for themselves. A couple months into this settlement, the first true states and empires began to take hold. On the central continent, called Talassi, there arose some kingdoms like Bipek, Drakkar, Michava, and various others. Our focus is just a tiny island off of the continent's southwest. Made of sand, stone, and a thin layer of dirt on top, it jutted sharply out of the ocean like a bowling pin. With just its tip exposed to the air, it was smaller than some players' houses. One could easily mistake the snow-capped island for one of the floating icebergs that surrounded it, had it not been for the out-of-place jungle, bushes, and trees that huddled together on the island under its blanket of icy frost. It was this tiny and desolate island that would serve as the birthplace of a grand civilization. A player of extraordinary destiny would soon arrive here, venturing past the settled lands of the continent and the myriad of squabbling tribes who violently pushed against each other for their holdings. This player found this desolate island and set up his first hidey-hole base for the night here. While tonight he was shivering in a little dirt cave and struggling to cook a pork chop in the furnace, it would only be a matter of months till he was proclaimed the divine son of the eternal God and emperor of the Holy Land and its people. This player's name was Luca FSB, founder and emperor of the Crusader Kingdom, who would lead a revolution of his society, faith, and the wars for his sacred lands. If there was one thing that Luca FSB knew how to do, it was rile up energy and attention for his new project. He would advertise loudly in chat about his grand new state, even though it was only a tiny, snowy island. When he was able to hook a new player that was looking for a nation to join, he would show them what he was building on his island, and reward them with diamond gear and a pre-built home he had available. King Luca was able to draw in little disparate communities to his island. New players, a handful of their friends, and his own friends from real life. Still active players like Hey TomCat, Maze FR, and David TG. It is well proven that new nations do very well when started by a group of friends. As they all got to work on the same little island, the vision became clearer with Luca's compounding proclamations. This was to be a Crusader Kingdom. Luca was inspired by his own Catholic faith and media like Crusader Kings 3 and the movie Kingdom of Heaven to bring the cross and sword to the medieval fantasy world of Abexilas. Many of the recruits and Luca's friends just went along with this vision because it was fun, but others shared this interest and fascination entirely, especially since the Crusaders would draw in all sorts of players from Italy and Europe. but the simple vision of a Crusader kingdom gave them all a unifying and familiar culture, easily shown and explained to the new players that stopped by the island, and very attractive to the scores of military zealots that populate the shores of Abexilas. To say, "we are the Crusader Kingdom," is to conjure familiar images of high medieval chevaliers, the Golden Cross, the conquest and expulsion of demonized heathens, and the mythos of Western medieval history. So instead of aimlessly building up their city and wealth as many communities do, their culture and premise gave them an implied mission. Every conflict became a holy war, every voice chat was a synod of lords and lieges, and every church and house built was the humble beginnings of a worldwide evangelization. Even if it wasn't explicitly stated, the players began building a popular Crusader identity in everything they did, on this little island we now call Old Crusadon. For now though, they remained small. The Crusaders expanded off the island with a flat layer of grass and stone, floating artificially on top of the deep, cold ocean. Walking around Old Crusadon leaves you feeling a bit jumbled and messy. Clearly, developing the island had more enthusiasm behind it than patience, without a top-down mind to organize and perfect everything. The town center is a flat courtyard of different types of stone cobbled together on the ground, with chests and crafting tables littered about, where the stone streets sprawl out of to twist and turn among where new houses and fenceless farms sprouted up like weeds. Areas of wooden planks are laid over the floating ground like boards, nailed to a ship's hull for repairs. All around are little trees, gardens, and storage areas strewn about, among stone houses and blocky, unfinished apartment complexes, as if each player took a corner for their own purpose and built it up without squaring it with their neighbors. The only refuge where one can find order and purpose in this little clumsy town could be in its central church, a mini cathedral rounded with checkered stained glass windows that bathe its surfaces in red, blue, and purple rays of light when the sun gets low, fashioned and secured in place by the first pope, player Jacobulus, or in the largest complex on the little island by the architect Pipo F. Over the moat's drawbridge and into the castle, a ring of walls and little stone towers encasing tightly packed peasant homes, lined with bushes and fluttering banners, angled around the central keep with its conference room on the second floor, or, at its heart, the castle's raison d'etre, the Iron Throne of King Luca FSB. These developments in Old Crusadon attracted more and more players as they kept aggressively recruiting. They would hold political and religious rallies in church. They would talk excitedly and chat about their growing island kingdom and hold energetic speeches and rallies for all to hear. Drawing in around 60 new players in the span of a few weeks, the vivaciousness of these medieval nights was attention-grabbing and captivating for some, as much as it was deeply annoying for others. One player, named Duxky II, responded in chat with insults and gloating to the Crusaders, telling them to shut up and calling them cringe. After several days of Duxky II's annoyed criticism, the Crusaders decided to take action. They squatted up and raided the town that he owned, called Thalmor, killing him and his citizens until they begged for them to leave. But Duxky II had a wealthy ally in a nearby town, a pirate nation called Seawolves, led by the player Tritter 11111. Tritter met with Duxky and told them to stop taunting the Crusaders, or this was just going to escalate. But Duxky didn't listen, and he kept hurling insults at the rambunctious group in chat, and the Crusaders responded with toxicity of their own. At this point, Tritter of Seawolves teleported to the island of Old Crusadon, in an attempt to smooth out their relationship with his allies. But during this, the Crusaders jumped out with 8 armed and armored players, and they slew him there in their town. The Crusaders kept up their aggressive momentum. They launched a raid upon Tritter's town called Whiteport, which was the capital of the Seawolves pirate nation and a major trade hub of the central continent. A horde of 20 Crusader knights clad with diamond armor and weapons, shimmering purple with enchantments, poured out of the forest into Whiteport. They jumped around on the cobblestone roads beneath great multi-story houses and dueled to the death on their barrel-like roofs. The Crusaders here were pushing civilians down in the street and breaking through their doors and furniture, spilling blood upon the cobble walkways and wooden walls. The Seawolf leader Tritter and 3 of his warriors pushed back against them, knocking back some Crusaders through their nether portals, wherein they were cut down and looted. The rest of them skirmished between the town's market stalls, and after more and more Crusader blood was spilled there, the attacking knights retreated back to their island home of Old Crusadon. The attack on Whiteport here was the first salvo in what would become an intense guerrilla war reaching across the continent. Intermittent raids began breaking out between the two little states, drawing in some of their friends and allies. One witness paints a picture of the sea wolves at Whiteport, expecting an oncoming raid by the Crusader Knights, so they dug deep fall traps, and when they were attacked, the newbie raiders kept falling into the defensive holes and dying. In response, the Crusader King Luca FSB put one of his key nobles, the player Milty, in charge of training a small militia to conduct their raids more skillfully. As the raiding progressed and got more destructive, the Sea Wolves escalated the conflict publicly and formally declared war against the Crusader Kingdom. Tritter publicly claimed in his declaration, quote, "There won't be peace in the world unless the quote-unquote Crusaders are dealt with. We, the Sea Wolves, will rally our allies and face the threat head-on. As for the ones that will side with the Crusaders, you will be supporting an entity whose sole purpose is to destabilize nearby nations. They do not deserve to be called a nation." This conflict, which had grown out of annoyances, insults, and misunderstandings, had now grown into a personal hatred between these two small nations. If one were to look at the private leadership chats of both nations, they would find an increasingly hostile culture of memes, insults, and propagandistic gloating upon their enemies in the guerrilla war. During one raid, an attacking band of 4 Sea Wolf warriors led by the player Nakdes became trapped in the Crusaders' central church. They barricaded the doors and fended off a great horde of the Crusader Knights. One Sea Wolf warrior, named Tranquility, then successfully snuck into the Crusaders' main castle and built a throne for himself there, mocking the Crusader King and proclaiming this land for the Sea Wolves as a deep insult to the island nation. A different raid saw the Crusaders attack the city of Whiteport once again, and they were being pushed out until Milty showed up with a squad of militia warriors and overpowered the defending Sea Wolves. They then went into the town market and slew the shopping customers, driving their business away with blood on the stalls. But this militia leader Milty somewhat believed that this conflict was going too far, and he wasn't afraid to go against his group and speak his own mind loudly. He publicly announced that they should make peace with Tritter and the Sea Wolves, as he called the Crusader Kingdom a young nation that only wished to roleplay, saying, "We Crusaders realize our mistake of raiding Duxkey City, unaware that they had the Sea Wolves as their allies. However, we think that their response is exaggerated. We have tried relying on diplomacy, but after several talks, it's obvious they only want war, especially because we are a roleplay nation and just 2 weeks old. We are not one of the strongest nations, and we might not have many chances of winning. However, if you think we will just watch our cities burn and do nothing while this scourge threatens our independence, you are mistaken." The aggressive call for diplomacy that Milty made here was dead upon arrival, as the Crusaders wanted the Sea Wolves to end the war by paying reparations and conceding defeat and guilt. The Sea Wolves, of course, had no interest in doing so. The war of back and forth raiding had brought the Crusaders into the international spotlight for the first time, as the official declarations of war and breakdown in diplomacy brought the prospect of escalation and intervening allies. The Sea Wolves made moves to shift the war to them, to threaten the heart of the blossoming Crusader Kingdom. They settled a new claim very close by on the mainland, called Meth Town, which could be used to launch an invasion upon the island of Old Crusadon. This, alongside the Sea Wolves' stockpiles of pirated money and supplies, showed that a devastating war of conquest was on the horizon, one that could extinguish the light of Crusader civilization forever. So as tensions ran higher and the future seemed more desperate, they would be more receptive to a call for drastic change. There was a saving grace that could secure the nation, and even bolster it for generations to come. While building an artificial island for Old Crusadon was a smart way to start a community with national sovereignty, it greatly limited how much they could expand, and how seriously they would be taken by other nations. Floating artificial islands were the domain of newbies and squatters, derogatory terms that the Sea Wolves used against the Crusaders even after having fought for weeks. But Milty contacted Luca with an unlikely connection, as he had friends across the sea in the southwestern continent of Halen. South of the powerful Kingdom of Leyden, there were 2 small nations called the Mendelia Republic and Arum Flora, which had both grown inactive and desolate. As the Crusaders started to feel the political pressure of the Sea Wolves and their allies upon their artificial island, the powerful Kingdom of Leyden encouraged the Crusaders to settle this depopulated land as their vassals.
There was a great discussion among the nation as to whether or not they should migrate to Halen. Luca FSB and the Crusaders chafed at the idea of being vassals to another nation, especially an unknown one like Leyden. But they figured they could declare independence but also maintain friendly relations once they were comfortably settled. The Crusader Pipo F was greatly upset by the idea, for he was the main builder of Old Crusadon, who had slaved away at the church and castle here. But the prospects of a new capital on solid ground were enticing, as they surveyed the area and saw that many of the towns and nations around had tiny populations and inactive areas that would be up for grabs. If they could build up their central capital quickly and recruit aggressively, they saw where they could expand their state with new settlements. So the Crusaders agreed, and so they signed contracts and worked out deals with many different parties. Luca FSB bought the inactive land south of Leyden from the leader of Mendelia, a player named Cuzless, who would later integrate and become a loyal cornerstone of the Crusader government. They would pay him $500,000 over the span of 4 months, which frankly shows that Cuzless placed a lot of trust in his new Crusader friends. So, in the middle of the night, by torchlight, all the leaders and civilians of the Crusader civilization boarded the ships with their belongings and set sail for the continent of Halen. While the Crusaders were busy with their migration, the Sea Wolves were making all the preparations to launch a drawn-out war and invasion. They built an ice fort in the open ocean near the island of Old Crusadon. They started grinding out war supply weapons, armor, and potions, and they gathered all their warriors and allies into a Discord server specifically dedicated to organizing a battle to conquer the island of Old Crusadon. The Sea Wolves tracked down Crusaders at shops and in the Nether to jump them with their best fighters and steal their loot. The raids moved to the new Holy Land in Halen, their fledgling city of Crusadon, having its roads stained with blood before it could even muster a proper stronghold or set of walls. Tensions became inflamed after an escalating international incident. The Crusaders had just conducted an intense religious sacrifice and mission to hunt down an evil spirit, defeating a wither in their city and gaining a Nether Star artifact imbued with great power. But the pirate leader Tritter snuck into their event and stole the artifact right from under their noses. The Crusaders Luca, FSB, and Milty were said to be shouting in their voice call, and so the re-emerging nation of the Crusaders pledged revenge upon the Sea Wolves. At this time, the Crusaders broke from their vassalage under Leyden, as the vassalage had been an irksome hit to the Crusader state's prestige. So Luca FSB paid the leaders of Leyden $150,000. While the Crusaders were starting anew and breaking their bonds, the Sea Wolves were meeting with their allies in the nation of Cori, Vagaria, Epicia, and Castanor, trying to rope them into the impending war of conquest against the Crusader Kingdom. This diplomatic development was secretly relayed to the Crusaders through a couple of players in the friendly Phoenix Imperium, who were also acting citizens of the Sea Wolves. The Sea Wolves claimed that they only ever fed them information that they wanted the Crusaders to know, having them work as double agents. But the shadowy nature of Minecraft espionage keeps the truth hidden to this day. The Sea Wolves were now prepared with a loaded gun to the head of the Crusader Kingdom, prepared with bases, allies, and weapons to invade and conquer them in a series of pitched battles, so they felt comfortable launching their most audacious raid yet. On a now famous July 14th attack, the Sea Wolves marched upon the city of Crusadon with the armies of 3 allies, killing many civilians and warriors there, pillaging their belongings, and occupying the city for hours on end. So the Crusaders, not to be outdone by this violence, went out and sought the most powerful mercenary force on the continent of Talassi, the armies of Drakkar. It is one thing to gather nations together to invade and occupy your enemy's town on here. It is another level entirely to hire out the bloodthirsty mercenary bands that fight on all the shores of Abexilas. For when mercenaries get involved in a war, it immediately becomes an arms race of who can buy the best mercenary gang, draw in the most international support, and supply them the best gear and logistics. The leader of Drakkar publicly announced their support for the Crusaders, saying, "The dragon intervenes. Sea Wolves is a fitting name for such pirates, for these low-life cutthroats do not know honor. They prey on the weak and defenseless, eager to snatch a child from its mother's arms for a couple of silver coins. And since their depravity seems to be boundless, we shall draw the line for them." As a result of this extremely raw declaration, the Sea Wolves sought out support from a rival mercenary group called Skyfall. These leaders sat in a voice call for 3 hours, negotiating and predicting the outcomes of a war like this. The Skyfall mercenaries would join the Sea Wolves in a battle for a $1 million paycheck. But estimations for how much a war like this would cost against the bloodthirsty Dragon of Drakkar went as high as $5 million, for other mercenary contracts and war supplies would be needed. Even then, the situation would probably end up bleak. After this call with the experienced war planners of the Skyfall mercenaries, the Sea Wolf leaders had to choose whether or not to launch this war, but everything pointed to the same result. Even with their allies and mercenaries, the conquest of the Crusader towns would leave them bleeding precious money, time, and energy, even if they won. And worse yet, now that the Crusaders were settled and active in the overseas continent of Halen, anything they did to them would have rippling effects across a patchwork of messy foreign politics, getting them tangled and tied up in a spiderweb of conflicts they didn't know existed. This discussion was a level of foresight that not many nation leaders possess, perhaps including the Crusaders. So the Sea Wolves approached the newly built town of Crusadon, seeing that in preparation for war, the Crusaders had built a massive, ugly deep slate wall around the town. The Crusader and Sea Wolf leaders sat in negotiations for a long time, but eventually emerged with a compromise that did not injure either side's pride or ego. There would be no more raiding, and all the injustices and insults would officially be forgiven. The Sea Wolves would sell 15 enchanted pickaxes to the Crusaders at a low price, and the Crusaders would tear down this ugly deep slate wall that surrounded their town. 3 days later, the Crusaders would host a ceremony and celebration in their town square, signing the official treaty that ended the conflict and committing the sides together in a non-aggression pact. The Crusaders and Sea Wolves partied together for the first time with no hostilities or violence. There is something of an interesting phenomenon here in the geopolitics of Abexilas, that many times, two peoples come together with close, friendly bonds after fighting a bitter and toxic war. The fighting leaders negotiate face-to-face with each other, the people see each other on the battlefield, they have a common history and story to reconstruct together from all sides, and everyone knows how their former enemies behave in times of stress and conflict. In a Minecraft war, you become familiar with your enemy, and the familiar is always comfortable, especially when the barrier to get to know them better is just a Discord message away. While sometimes former enemies in war may try to come together only to poison their union and betray each other, the Crusaders and Sea Wolves became good friends. Their non-aggression pact upgraded into a mutual defense pact under the diplomacy of the Crusader, BB1. And this is a generational alliance that still holds to this day. With both the conflict against the Sea Wolves and their migration to the southwestern continent of Halen concluded, the Crusaders now had the breathing room to build up their new capital of Crusadon. You enter the city over a thick stone bridge across a wide river from the south, lined with drooping red banners embroidered with ornate golden crosses. As you step back onto the grassy paths of firm land, you are welcomed by a monument of a slim stone cross, just in case you didn't know where you were. All travelers must be let in through the gateway by the guards there, who sit inside the thick, lantern-lit walls of andesite and stone, which have become mossy over the years due to the birch forest rains that batter the city. The entire town is fortified within a rectangle of these obliquely built walls, which appear stout and dwarf-like until you step to the base of their long shadows. Entering the city provides clear views down the wide stone roads dividing large houses and facilities, where the smallest sheds for storing hay and firewood are the size of peasant homes in some other nations. The outer ring along the town walls is nearly a grid of homes, workshops, and stables interspersed with little fountains, wells, gardens, and streets, adorned with work carts and decorative banners, swaying in the cold breezes that descend from the colorfully tiled roofs. Closer toward the city center brings you up the steps of a couple stone terraces, where the markets and shops rest above the houses, and the town square caps it all off. At the center of the square stands a small bedrock pillar, turned into the city's central light, with a soul flame and a beacon shining up into the sky. Around this courtyard would develop the cornerstone buildings of a Crusader's public and political life. To its east lies the great cathedral, adorned in stained glass so that the rising sun may bathe its golden cross and altar in radiant light. Next to this is the nation's council chambers, a birch and sandstone building framed in ornate stone carvings, where inside work the bureaucrats and nation leaders by dim lantern light, firing away tirelessly as the nervous center for the unsexy paperwork and arguments of state. Beside this is a raised open-air Greek-style temple, which once hosted a great flame to symbolize the vital heart of the nation, but it was wrecked and destroyed when an evil god later spawned a violent red meteor, which punched through its double-thick flat stone roof, implanting beneath the Crusader city a little seed of evil to come. To the courtyard's south now stands their palace castle, built as concentric rings of Romanesque stone towers adorned with golden terracotta bands, with each tower rising up to the heavens, their pastel spires growing higher and brighter until it reaches the very center, just above the clouds. Walking through the castle walls exposes the signs and sigil of the Crusaders' cross in every facade, as you walk through the mighty spruce doors into footstep-echoing halls of blackstone and deep slate, adorned by paintings and the black, white, and red banners of the Crusader cross, approaching the red stool throne of the Emperor. And finally, poised over the town square, looking into the cathedral, stands the colossal stone statue of Emperor Luca FSB, adorned in the full regalia and arms of the Crusader Knights, watching over the market and spawn of the city. The city of Crusadon is constructed so that its palace, cathedral, and monuments reach up towards the sky, uncontested by anything on the horizon, so that none in the city may forget the divinity laid in the bricks of this settlement's foundation, or the eternal power of its king. Every week, the people of Crusadon gather under the ringing bells and note-block chimes of the cathedral, as the priests and leaders of state instill proper public morals and mythology into the working population. Here you may hear a sermon from the lore master Un Marco 025134, or Pope Dane, recounting the creation of the world and the cosmic struggle of darkness and light, at the center of which lies the Crusader Kingdom. All the hymns and alms of this church are offered up to the Eternal, the all-powerful and all-good God, who was a spark in the primordial darkness. He took his own light and wove together the stars as the seeds of life among worlds, then the four cosmic tools and weapons to defend order and light from chaos and darkness, and then the demigod twins that tore darkness and light apart, which separated from light the elements of the earth and nature. The Eternal fashioned living souls using his own light, fixed upon the elements, where the unfavored beings became the animals and the favored became humans. Around the center of creation lies a myriad of afterlife realms with angels and demons, but creeping and scheming among them all is the demon lord Fossok, the personage of the primordial darkness and chaos who plots an unceasing war with the Eternal, constantly meddling and twisting the affairs of creation so that it cannot act in harmonious nature with the light. While some scoff at the idea of Fossok influencing their daily affairs, he showed himself to be very real and very dangerous when he unleashed a twisted virus upon the people of Crusadon. Those who were infected with this dark magic virus, called Cerebrefito, were transformed into horrific, unearthly, deformed versions of themselves. Their minds and senses were slowly captured and puppeted by Fossok directly, and so a shadowy cult of these corrupted puppets grew beneath Crusadon. They would secretly meet in the underground hospital, with corrupted players like Flavius Icarius, Archie Noble, Zagian, Oreo Chaos, Hey Tomcat, and the noble prince DuperKnight. But before these corrupted souls could spill out into the streets for bloodshed, the Eternal in his protectiveness guided the player Un Marco to finding a cure that would neutralize and defeat the disease. Funnily enough, it started as a concoction of chocolate milk. This cure worked to cleanse every corrupted Crusader soul of Fossok's deformity and puppetry, except for one, the Prince DuperKnight, who retained a tiny seed of this darkness that would lay dormant for years to come. All of these events in the broad theology of the Eternal and Fossok were supposedly predicted over 150 years ago in the prior worlds, attributed to the prophet named Zeno. Zeno had revealed to his followers the cosmic war between the Eternal's light and Fossok's darkness, predicting the coming incarnation of the Eternal as a leader who on the worldly plane would unite the realms of light and shadow, and establish a holy dynasty that would fulfill and maintain this mission across the generations. So this prophesied coming son of the Eternal was later on fulfilled by the state's founder and king, Luca FSB. The Crusader Kingdom itself is therefore the direct incarnation of the Eternal's will, the mortal human embodiment of his light and influence on the hearts of man. The Crusaders are charged with protecting the Eternal's light and destroying the demon lord Fosok's darkness, so that the Divine Emperor may unite them back together and finally restore the rightful order of the cosmos. It is in this church that the people of Crusadon learn why they call themselves Crusaders, why they must fight and cure the Fosok-possessed enemies of the kingdom, and why they must always work to serve the interests of the Emperor, for this society was formed by the Eternal himself to restore the cosmic order through the almighty power of his crusade. But just because the leaders taught and preached this cosmic political order and mission did not necessarily mean everyone would fall in line. As Crusadon built up its great stone monuments, its people ventured out to settle smaller towns around the land, and this raised a sensitive question. What relationship would these other towns have to their capital? The recently appointed Minister of Defense, a young and wealthy player named Rathnir 05067, argued with the nation's leaders that the Crusaders should decentralize themselves. They should give the military purely over to himself and select another town as their economic capital to build up. He argued that this would spread the prosperity of the state around and lead to its long-term growth. But the leaders were unconvinced by his pleas to assume a stronger grasp on political and military power, especially since shifting focus to other towns would lessen the role of Crusadon as a social and trade hub, which would diminish the vital activity that drove the community forward. So the Minister Rathnir was banished with a couple of his followers, and the Crusaders maintained a lock on their own centralized control. The noble Milty had been critical of Luca for assigning these ministers, as the country was not big enough to necessitate them. It would just give these inexperienced and disloyal players the chance to cause trouble. Eventually, they would rectify this by merging the ministerial role with those of the nation's dynastic dukes and princes. This event nowadays is remembered as the Minister's Rebellion, where a random player sought power, started an argument, and got exiled for not being subtle about his ambitions. But this argument was indicative of a slow change that was starting to gain momentum within the Crusader Kingdom. It had been a few months since the nation had been founded. Things were settling down, and people were reflecting on the past and reconsidering their futures. Even if the whole society was built up around a centralized, divinely appointed monarchy, the lords and citizens could still wonder in their private chambers at night. What did they want out of all this? The noble player Milty had been critical of Emperor Luca for a variety of reasons, and while he was a longtime member of the Crusaders who had been instrumental to fighting the Sea Wolves and resettling here in Halen, he had motivations completely separate from the rest of the kingdom. Milty was an experienced player of server geopolitics, as he ran a community on the prior world of Eldom. He already had a lot of relationships and connections to players around the world from those days, and his ultimate goal was to recreate that community here on the world of Abexilas. The master diplomat of the Crusaders, player BB1, was Milty's close friend, and he happened to own a Crusader colony called BB-Grad on the faraway southern bay of the continent. So, with Luca FSB's permission, Milty bought this land from BB for $85,000 and turned it into his own new little country, bringing over a group of Crusaders as well as some mutual friends, particularly the Crusader player Folded Celery 952, a sly Machiavellian politician who would become his new second-in-command. So now founded was Milty's new nearby nation of Eternia. But little did anyone know, this decision to sell land to Milty would end up butterflying into a series of conflicts, betrayals, and a war that would grip the entire continent. Milty's new nation of Eternia was founded in a geopolitical hotspot on the continent, among a checkerboard of small nations that were in the process of falling over, one by one, as vassals to the regional hegemon, a massive nation called Razau. Razau was comprised of very experienced and ruthless players from Eldom, who already had a pre-existing relationship with Milty, and to put it charitably, they were not too fond of each other. So as Milty was setting up his new little nation of Eternia, he naturally reached back out to Luca FSB, requesting to form a full military alliance and defensive pact. It was only natural, considering that Milty had been a leader of the Crusaders for a few months before then, and he acquired this land off of a generous land deal from his Crusader friend BB. But Luca refused, only committing to sign a non-aggression pact, saying he would go no further than promising not to attack each other. Luca did not want to publicly sign the Crusader Kingdom up for any conflicts with these powerful neighbors with which Milty already had diplomatic issues, and for the rather self-centered community of Crusaders, this was a pretty standard position to take. But resentment built up in Milty over this refusal, and he got pretty nasty to Luca about it in their private chats. After a back and forth of all this toxicity, their friendship and diplomatic ties broke down, and the raids across Halen into Eternia began. As this raiding broke out, it became clear that this conflict would at least feel different than that with the Sea Wolves. Remember that Milty had been a longtime friend and companion of the Crusaders, and he had built up the Eternian government along with other Crusaders and mutual friends. So they had friends fighting friends on two sides of a conflict driven by their leaders, and anytime someone made a move on the chessboard of this emerging war, it did not feel like a back and forth sportish sparring match of war tactics and PvP. It felt like your friend was stabbing you in the back. The Crusaders seemed to have taken this to heart, so they did not just conjure up a little militia like before. They fully readied themselves to spill the blood of the Eternian players on their streets, equipped with a newly arrived mercenary group from faraway lands. An important player named Alec49 came from the central continent of Talasi, as he and his group struggled with the government of their homeland, a nation called Michava. Here they attacked the Michavan government in a coup, and sold off several of their towns to their enemies around them, before leaving to Halen. The war leader Alec49 joined up with the Crusaders, connected together by their shared Italian nationality. So now, just as the Crusaders were rallying against their former friends, Alec shows up as a hardened general of experienced knights and mercenaries, and the Crusaders are now armed with a true weapon of war, a professional army called Adiutrix. The Crusader forces would ride into the town of Nova Eternia, on the main street surrounded by bleached walls and pillars of Greco-Roman temples and villas, and they would cut down the busy workers and miners, smashing their materials to dust and occupying the town so they could not hope to build or fortify themselves. As the Crusaders repeatedly stunned the Eternians and halted their productivity with devastating raids, the few fighters in the Eternian militia would track down lone Crusaders in the world and sneak attack them with precise surprise strikes. The attacks went on and on like this, with the Crusaders' Adiutrix warriors butchering crowds of Eternians, and Eternians jumping and mocking the murdered Crusaders. Milty was able to call some warriors from his old nation to train his militia, and they launched a raid upon Crusadon, and finding themselves surrounded 10-3, they cut their way out of it and slew the Crusader guards in their own city. As each side battled for dominance, they got more heated in how they played their chess pieces in this conflict. Milty tried to pull a cunning card and covertly reached out to one of the Crusader fighters, named Royal Crystal. Milty had previously appointed them as the new leader of the Crusader militia before he left for Eternia, so perhaps Royal Crystal still had some loyalty to him and his cause. But it didn't pan out, and when Luca FSB learned of this attempt to poach one of his people, he flew into a rage, ordering the Crusaders to go into the Eternian community Discord and flood them with memes and propaganda, mocking them to their faces and gloating about the blood-stained success of their professional army. But Milty tried again, and he reached out to the Crusader that sold his land for the making of Eternia, BB1, who was recently forced out of the conflict after being temporarily banned from the server, but he too rejected this offer. Milty didn't have too many cards to play in this war. The barbaric warriors of Adiutrix were slaughtering his people and grinding the development of his young community to a halt, and he proved unable to exploit the cracks in the Crusaders' government and their loyalties. All this, and the consistent mocking of the Crusader propaganda machine, weighed on him until he began to crack under the pressure. The Crusaders' strategy to spitefully push and agitate the Eternians into submission was beginning to bear fruit. Milty's second in command, Folded Celery 952, began to truly worry about his side in this war. In one voice call where the Crusaders and Eternians were trying to re-establish any diplomacy at all, Milty snapped and shouted at the attacking Crusaders in a fit of rage, which ended the talks right there, and only entrenched the Crusaders in keeping up their campaign to agitate them into submission. Folded Celery began to conflict with Milty over the prosecution of this war, and when Folded couldn't get through to him about changing strategy or making any concessions, he quietly gave up trying and began slipping information to the Crusaders in secret. When the Crusaders attacked, sent mocking memes, or disparaged him in public announcements, Folded would tell them how his leader responded in private and what exactly about it was agitating him. So they kept pushing and raiding again and again until the agitation drove Milty to full paranoia and an effective breakdown of his political order. Seeing the dissolution of Eternia's politics, Luca and Alec whispered once more into the ear of Folded Celery that now was the time to jump ship. Leave this destitute nation with your people and make your own nation where you stood a chance. And Folded Celery agreed, so he took a large mass of his people on an exodus north over the sea to create his own version of their previously planned nation, the Phoenix Imperium. The Crusaders celebrated this as a successful coup d'etat, and Milty, being left with a depopulated town and surrounded by the hostile lands and vassals of Razau, dejectedly sold off his project and exiled himself to the wilderness. Here he would wander in obscurity and shame, until resentment and bitterness grew in his chest to strike back at his former friends, who took away everything he had and mocked him for it. He would return to the lands of the Crusaders just to tear them apart and fling them into the most brutal war of this hemisphere in a spiraling act of bloody revenge. It was around this time that Luca FSB would be temporarily banned from the server for some toxic messages, and this threw the Crusaders into a political crisis, because their whole government and cultural identity was wrapped up around Luca as their founder and emperor. It is quite a feat to create a strong cult of personality, reminiscent of the pharaohs of Egypt or the Emperor of Mankind from Warhammer 40k. As the founder of the nation, Luca's personality and vision were the cornerstones to how people perceived this state and its community. And with the unsubtle efforts to build a mythology around the Emperor and to expel and suppress any public political dissent, the state would essentially lose its guiding figure that held ultimate authority on any decisions. But Luca FSB obviously wasn't the only one with any authority. Alec 49 ran the professional military of Adiutrix, BB1 conducted state diplomacy, Un Marco 025134 was the state lore master, J. Cubulus was the pope, and there were many other seats on the council. While the state was certainly authoritarian, this council had some kind of check on King Luca's powers, as he often led things with their advice and consent. The players of the council would maintain their power and legitimacy through their personal relationship with Luca and with the other council players, and they would be kept from ambitiously seeking more power by the security of Luca's royal status. Everyone felt like you could not just replace Luca FSB. He was the founder of the state and the charismatic personality that gave it direction. This institution therefore offered some stability, as it held people's political positions in place and prevented any destabilizing power politics. So what happens when he who sits on the throne is simply plucked out of the game? The High Council of the Crusaders immediately had this issue because Luca did not name an official heir. First, they tried to vote on who should become the new king. BB1 ended up winning the poll, but he was being particularly nasty to his rival player Cuzless during this, and some suspect that he may have rigged the vote in his favor. BB1 would also end up getting temporarily banned soon after, and it turned out that neither he nor Cuzless really wanted to assume the responsibility of being king. So instead they reached out to Luca FSB's eldest son on their roleplay family tree, the player Mr. Calcestruzzo. BB, Cuzless, and their friend Folded Celery 952 had a lot of influence over the young King Calce, and this king was aware and fine with acting as a puppet, so together they immediately got to work. In the smoky back room of the council chambers, BB and Alec drafted up a plan called the Ducal Reforms, which would reorganize a lot of the grounded authority over the nation's government. It would confer more power upon the royal princes, which was a role that the current King Calce would surely fall back to when Luca FSB returned from his ban. It would give the prince the authority to appoint dukes who were not in the royal family, and to transfer the ownership of key towns in the kingdom over to the political allies of BB, Alec, and Folded Celery. This plan was drafted up and King Calce agreed to pass it, but the change did not yet take effect. The young king was busy planning a wedding with Folded Celery's niece, a leader of his Phoenix Imperium. They held a grand wedding in the Cathedral of Crusadon, under the blue and red light of its stained glass windows, when suddenly, Luca FSB threw open its doors and marched up to stand on the altar, proclaiming, "This wedding will not happen!" He had been unbanned early, after only 2 weeks, and had been secretly told of this marriage by a disagreeing Alacordi IX. After this, King Calche abdicated, and things peacefully went back to the way they were. The ducal reforms never went into effect, and Luca could reascend the throne. But as with all things, it was never quite that easy. First, the church's pope named Jacobulus was found conspiring to assassinate the king and launch a coup, so he was exiled from the kingdom. Second, Luca did not immediately assume the position as king, so the High Council elected to elevate his adopted son to the throne, player DuperKnight. DuperKnight had been in the Crusaders for a few months at this point, having started by building the wall around the capital city Crusadon, working his way up the government as the leader of the state's intelligence agency, the CSB, catching the malevolent Cerebrefito plague, and designing the nation's flag and propaganda. Eventually, Luca adopted him into the royal family tree, so now at this point, he could be elected as a legitimate king. DuperKnight would have been an attractive choice for king, as he could be a stabilizing force to bring back a semblance of peace and order, contrasted with King Calche's rule, which was marred by council factions maneuvering against each other, trying to manipulate the powers in their favor. But Luca still had overwhelming political influence. Even though he wasn't very active on the server, he proclaimed at DuperKnight's coronation that Duper would have the same powers as himself, implying that he would keep things straight in the background, and even announcing that BB1 would also become a co-king with DuperKnight. So now it was a kind of diarchy. Or triarchy, because only 2 weeks later, Luca fully committed to leading the nation again, and he asserted himself over King DuperKnight and the later coronated King Bibi, crowning himself as emperor over a newly declared Crusader Empire. So in this turbulent few weeks of backroom deals, court factionalism, planned coups, and reshuffling power, a new status quo was finally settling over the Crusader Empire. Of course, Luca was back at the center of it as the emperor. DuperKnight was the king of the west, and Bibi was the king of the east. The two kings were supposed to have the same authority as the emperor, with the exception that Luca had the ultimate say over any decisions, so naturally over time, the two kingships would be overshadowed by the emperor. And in a reorganization just a month later, when King DuperKnight abdicated his political responsibilities, the kingships were reorganized into a kind of Prince's Regency Council. So everything was back to normal, except now we don't call this a kingdom, as Luca proclaimed, "The Eternal, seeing the development of events, decided to send me once again on Earth to rule over the Crusaders and set them free again from the evils of this world with the help of my sons. The Crusaders' kingdom will be known as the Crusaders Empire. I crowned myself emperor after my return from the heavens, as the Eternal had spoken, return and command over the earth, over land and seas, and inherit the kingdom of heaven, making us triumphant over the enemies of the empire." One might notice in the history of the Crusader Empire that this group mostly looks inward. A lot of their time and energy is focused on their politics, whereas other groups of Abexilas might do nothing but travel the world fighting various wars. But this isolationism was beginning to subside. As these political developments were going on, from the reigns of King Calche, King Duper, and the new status quo of the Empire, the Crusaders were starting to reach their hands out into the continental politics of Helen. At this time, there was a wave of communist uprisings and revolutions across the world of Abexilas. They were organized in the Abexilan Socialist International, or ASI, and came to hold significant political power over many regions of the world. But all this political energy flowing in one direction, especially in such a controversial direction as Shadowist communism, began to breed a reaction among its opponents. When one socialist nation, called the United Collectivist Republics of Krasnoy, gained a foothold in some friendly territory, the Crusaders were among the first to react with violent disgust. Revolutionary communism and feudal theocracy tend to be at odds with one another, especially if they must share the same space. The Crusader leaders Luca, Alec, and Bibi started a new ideological alliance called the Holy League, and the master diplomat Bibi assembled together the nations of Ivris, Michava, Seawolves, and Laetaris in order to combat the rise of global communism. There was a meeting between Luca and a large delegation of socialist leaders, and as young socialists often do, they began yelling at Luca. So war was declared, and the ASI and Holy League nations began exchanging raids on each other's cities. This was not a personal conflict among friends, so there was very little personal drama between the people involved here. Abexilas in this period was host to a large, sustained period of socialist and anti-socialist nations tussling in a bunch of loose, informal spats of raiding. But the Holy League was one of the most organized and devoutly anti-communist forces around. Weeks upon weeks of skirmishes played out around Halen and the other continents. It was one of those wars where neither side had proactive goals of conquest and pillage, so instead they could conduct whatever operations they wanted and claim very public victories over the other. This was such an informal war that one of its most substantial events had nothing to do with communism or the ASI. Alec was able to mobilize the Holy League for his own purposes in his faraway homeland of Michava, where they helped coup the long-standing government there, replacing it with a regime more friendly to the Crusaders and expanding their colonial holdings within Halen. Over time, though, both sides became more familiar with each other, and they got distracted by more pressing local politics than the progression of global communism. The Holy League slowly shifted away from its original purpose, having gained new members in time as it became a general alliance of conservative Halenite nations called the Alliance of Sacred Crowns. This organization would persist in name for a long time, but its relevance faded away as the other politics and issues drew new divisions among continental powers. The Abexilan Socialist International staked their flag in the slowed momentum of their Holy League enemies, and so they claimed ultimate victory in this war, even if no one had fought a battle for months. To call this mini-conflict between the Holy League and the Abexilan Socialists a war might be quite pretentious though, because it stands directly in the shadow of an explosion of regional violence that gripped much of Halen only a couple weeks later. To simplify a very complex story, there were two big groups vying for control over Western Halen, the nation of Soliana and the mercenary nation of Skellige. Skellige created and led a military alliance of the weaker nearby nations called the Halen League, in order to assert some authority over them. But Soliana was eagerly looking to expand across the island region of the continent's west called Zerilia. As often happens in history, it was two regional rising powers about to bump heads and duke it out for continental supremacy. And of course, the powder keg was ignited by one little spark, when one of the little nations of Skellige's Halen League settled and claimed to annex a vacant area in Soliana's land. Soliana consolidated their allies and vassals under a counter-military alliance of their own, called the Swords of Halen. The regional war ended up spiraling into three theaters. First, two minor allies on each side, called Alamein and Melzia, attacked each other to begin a sort of proxy war in the north. Then, a city-state called Steelwater, which was a vassal of Soliana, revolted and joined the Halen League instead, so Soliana launched an assault against them. Then Soliana directly attacked a town called Fort Heston in the Halen League. This was the first great regional war in the entire world of Abexilas, and among the powers of Soliana and Skellige, there was all sorts of politicking, backstabbing, and brilliant military strategy. But the Crusaders experienced all this from quite an odd perspective. As Skellige was earlier expanding their Halen League, the Crusaders were still fighting Milty and his little nation of Eternia. Well, Milty had pledged Eternia to the Halen League, so the Crusaders did so too, just to make sure that this big alliance would not interfere in their local conflict. But importantly, the Crusaders had no idea that this league that they had entered into was the center of a spiderweb of alliances and conflicts. But they held a good relationship with the mercenaries of Skellige, so when they saw that war was about to erupt for the future of the continent, Skellige promised to give them the territory on their western flank in order to further secure and strengthen them on the off chance that their powerful neighbor of Leyden would ever want to attack the Crusaders across the river. But as the war progressed, the Skelligan leader kept saying that he wanted to turn the Halen League into a kind of union if they succeeded, and they were taking a lot of materials from their small nation partners on the League's terms. Many quickly caught on that Skellige was working to consolidate power over the League, and they began revolting when Skellige began losing its battles. The Crusader neighbor and League nation Leyden announced at this time that they would be switching sides and joining Soliana in the war, as their leader, player Wormpia, exclaimed, "We happily joined the HL, thinking it was an alliance made up of nations with equal standing, with the goal of defending and developing our fellow Halenites because it was the right thing to do. Sadly, we were very wrong. they wanted weaker member states to be attacked so that they can, quote-unquote, defend them, but what they are really doing is turning them into their puppet states. These states think Skellige is defending them because they are kind and selfless, but the reality is that they would throw them under the bus without a second thought if they had something to gain from it. For these reasons, we will be joining the Swords of Halen, as they can provide the security and protection we want without the extortion of the Halen League. The Crusaders came to feel similarly, as they had contributed to 2 battles in defense of the city-state of Steelwater, but the Soliana opposition had won both times and pushed them back, and looking at the updating battle maps, Skellige and the Halen League were on the back foot in all 3 theaters of the war. It was on the same day that Soliana made a final push on every front, so Skellige announced in desperation to their allies that none of them could stay in the Halen League unless they grinded out 120 sets of war weapons and armor, an impossible standard for these little nations to make. So, simply put, no one did it, and the Halen League just dissipated into thin air. Skellige was left broke and powerless against the final assaults, so their nation collapsed, and they fled this continent entirely. With the League broken up and scattered to the wind, there was no one left to negotiate the war. The Crusaders, as well as the nearby power of Akashiro, then stepped up to come up with a peace treaty that gave the region of Zorilia over to Soliana, including a small town of their own. But none of the League members responded to the Crusaders' diplomacy, so Luca FSB just dropped the agreement and left Soliana to do as they wished. Many of the Halen League mayors near Soliana's borders revolted from their nations, and they willingly joined up with the victorious Soliana, cementing the nation as the preeminent power in this corner of the world. The Crusaders quite reasonably felt exploited and betrayed by this whole series of events. They felt like their supposed allies in Skellige had thrown them into battle to defend a faraway patch of land they didn't care about. They felt exploited into grinding out gear for their war. They didn't make good on any of the promises that brought them in, and they left the entire mainland region of Halen a disorganized mess with no direction or sense of stability. And the worst part was that their mighty neighbor of Leyden had switched sides against them in the war. So now the Crusaders and Leyden had both found themselves as the most put together and ambitious nations in a disarrayed region where everyone else was reeling from defeat. The Kingdom of Leyden was the first of the Crusaders' allies here in the continent of Halen. They used to be a helpful and friendly state that may have benefited from settling potential Crusader allies right near them, but now they were a powerful kingdom just across the river that had its eyes set on conquest. Leyden is a kingdom within the wider state network of Amiris, a multi-tentacled beast that reaches out and grasps at the geopolitics in many regions of the western side of Abexilas. These players share a history, having come from the old nation of the AWE in the former world of Eldom, and so they act in coordination, leading many states in united and cooperative interests. So Leyden is not just Leyden, but also a powerful cornerstone of this whole political bloc that is intimately familiar with history's most subversive yet effective political tactics. So the mosaic of players Geostyle, Oscar 105, Emu Blue, Archeon, Hob Zero, Rage of Fire, and Wyrmpia cast a long shadow upon the politics of Abexilas. The city of Leyden is a medieval bastion that serves as a monument to the wealth and stability wrought from this kind of political might.
Situated on a great winding river that traverses through lush swaths of various forests, the city is known for its vibrancy grown out of old stones. To walk through Leyden is to walk through time. Outside its stone walls of bricks and cobble, there lays round fields of crops and berry bushes, as well as flowers for the city's ornaments and textiles. Walking the wide streets of matted dirt and grass underfoot, it's easy to see the people that live here in their day-to-day, with piles of firewood stacked up beside the houses, hay bales for the animals passing into market, and public troughs collecting rainwater. The busy lives of peasants and city folk may not give time here to appreciate that they live among the stuff of fantasy, with every commoner's house and lazy guard's outpost on the walls being capped with bright red mushroom blocks and terracotta tiling, as if it all sprouts out of the old wood beams and stone foundations, like crimson fungal roofs, or the city's central cathedral, built with black stones on the bottom which fade into gray like a monolithic mountain anchoring the city to the ground, then turning into green stone upon the top faces of the spires, topped with the same red mushroom and tiled textures of the city roofs below. On every corner and buttress of the cathedral stands a moss-covered stone carving of a quaint evergreen tree in fine detail.
The gray and green monoliths tower over the town as if their god took the surrounding hills and lush forests and perched them atop the city like a crown, only to be impeded on by the fungal red sprouting caps upon the spires and clock tower, speaking true that Leyden conquers over the natural world around it. Despite what some people might say, Leyden had all the reason in the world to look across the river and target the Crusaders. Remember how Leyden had been in the Halen League under Skellige, and remember how they switched sides to join Soliana when it was clear that Skellige was just trying to exert power over them while they were losing the war. The Crusaders had already been in the Halen League for a little bit when Leyden joined up with them, but one troublesome player pointed the Leydish leaders' attention towards an archived ticket in the Halen League's Discord server. This was a little chat channel that preserved a conversation between Luca FSB and the Skelligan leaders, and it showed Luca FSB trying to convince Skellige to lead an invasion into Leyden to split the kingdom in half. The Crusaders were worried about their powerful neighbor to the north pressing down upon them, so as often happens in history, the Crusaders' insecurity pushed them to covertly act aggressive against Leyden. The Skelligan leaders did not care for the idea of invading Leyden, so the ticket was closed and the proposition was put to rest. But now that the Leydish leaders were reading through this conversation, the damage to their relationship was done. Luca FSB had created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By trying to preempt a potential attack by Leyden, they directly caused them to mobilize for war. And the player that showed Leyden this damning transcript in the archives, it was none other than the exiled former Crusader, the rogue player who had sworn revenge upon his former nation, Milty.
Milty coordinated with the leaders of Leyden, who knew about his personal connections to many within the Crusader Empire. And so a plan was concocted that relied on Milty's ability to sway some of the outlying Crusader mayors to join their side. If they could play up their distrust of Emperor Luca FSB to convince them to cut ties with the Crusaders and start a civil war among them, Leyden would swoop in with their allies, beat the Crusaders back, and rip apart the fabric of the Crusaders so that they would surrender and maybe even quit the server entirely.
At that point, Leyden could annex the emptied land, and either resettle it or sell it off at a profit. This plan struck right at the heart of a structural weakness that plagued the feudal system of the Crusaders, and many other nations in Abexilas. The territorial integrity of the nation was built solely on the trust and loyalty of its constituent mayors. If these mayors were given enough reason to abandon their old leader and country, then it spirals the nation into a crisis, the kind that is much easier to start than to finish. It must be the central goal of a feudal king at all times to secure and reinforce the loyalty of his vassal mayors over and over again, lest someone take advantage of their boredom and alienation. So Milty spoke to the mayors of 4 towns in the western marches of the Crusader territory:
Flavius Icarius of Fort Flavius, Bishop Roythan of Riverdame, Un Marco 025134 of Fabrichaven, and Cuzlis of Cosero. Milty spoke harshly of the other Crusader leaders, saying that they were fickle and bombastic with no real power or military to clean up the messes that they made. Milty promised that if they would rebel against Luca, they could have a so-called miltocratic government, based off of the Patrician Republic of ancient Rome. Flavius accepted the treasonous proposition first, then Roythan accepted, as he was made a direct offer from Leyden's leadership, then Un Marco 025134. Cuzlis was the only one to reject Milty to his face, and he immediately went and told Luca of the conspiracy against the state.
But it was too late. Flavius Icarius had declared independence with Fort Flavius, and Roythan declared independence with Riverdame. Un Marco gave the town of Fabrichaven over to one of the leaders of Leyden, and was able to secure the ownership of the city of Crusaden for himself. However, he very quickly had a change of heart, even though his brother Flavius convinced him to join the rebellion, and Milty promised him a central government. Un Marco immediately felt bad about the betrayal, so he gave Crusaden back to the Crusaders and rejoined up with them. Milty's rebellion had just erupted, as he proclaimed, "I'm helping the nobles of the Crusader Empire to free the country from Emperor Luca, an unprecedented tyrant. The quote-unquote emperor exploits our citizens for money. He takes credits for other people's work, is extremely racist just because some rivalries within the game. He declares his enemies people and countries just because of their ideology. He kicks out the people who have helped him and played with him since the start without hesitation. He breaks his alliances when the allies go to war. We We are not like this. He does not represent us anymore. Luca must be removed from the throne, and that is why we fight today." The towns of Fort Flavius, Fabrikhaven, and Riverdame now formed their own little nation, which the Mayor Roy then handed over to the Leyden leader, Player Wormpia. And just like that, a minor league of rebellious local mayors immediately escalated to a defensive war against an imperialistic kingdom of Leyden. And Milty was given a house in Leyden, so he could watch from the front lines as his enemies across the river burned. Both sides took about a week to prepare for war. During this, Alaquirty and the Adutrix mercenaries raided civilians in the city of Leyden, while Leyden warriors raided Crusadon back. Alec, with the help of the Adutrix mercenaries and players from a town called Eloria, settled 2 tiny squatter claims in the mainland of Leyden. This caused a stir and some instability, but ultimately did not produce the rebellion that they had hoped for. Luca FSB attempted to corrupt a couple mayors in Leyden's province of Linden. He spent $300,000 to get the players of 9 Assassin and Sorn 111 to rebel, but it was fruitless because they lied, and Luca's master diplomat BB1 criticized him for this waste of resources. BB, meanwhile, was busy bringing in an extensive list of their current allies into the conflict, the first being Seawolves, who volunteered upon seeing Milty's announcement of the rebellion, but later there was Michava, Kori, Brukel, Danmalis, Valera, Dawnfur, Staslov, Laetaris, Ivris, Manjing, Regnum Aquilarum, Azuria, and some of the remnants of the Scalaga mercenaries. From far and near, players would flock to the defense of the Crusaders Empire. But while the Crusaders tinkered about with rebellions and raids, Leyden had a massive and devastating trick up its sleeve. The Kingdom of Leyden was tightly aligned with the prominent nation of Soliana, as they had won the war for Halen together and established Soliana's hegemony over the continent. But Soliana's alliances were not very publicly known. They were based on private personal relationships of its leaders and greatest mercenary warriors, so they hatched a plan together, that Soliana would pretend to join the Crusaders' alliance to fight against Leyden, but they would turn on them at just the right moment to push them out of their own towns, to swiftly crush them and complete a conquest. What they would do is, Soliana would open a front on Leyden's little village of Grimbad, and here they would fight a sort of mock war to gain the Crusaders' trust, and make them overconfident by staging false victories. Soliana would plan its attack so that some of the Crusaders would rush out in all their gear, and the skilled PvPers of Leyden would cut them down and take their weapons and armor for themselves. As this was going on, Soliana would have a couple of its warriors, Rapid Fire 323 and Alex is the Best, scour the land claim with capture blocks. To quickly understand how these battles of conquest work, these capture blocks were the mechanical means of fighting a battle. Players could conquer portions of the city that they were attacking. If you placed a capture block and defended it for a few minutes, that chunk would be unclaimed, and you would get points in the war. But if you placed a capture block and the defending army successfully fought past your warriors and destroyed it, then they would gain points. Leyden planned for the fake alliance of the Crusaders and Soliana to aggressively place down their cap blocks and win this battle at Grimbad. Soliana would earn the trust of the Crusaders here, so that they could take more and more control of their war effort and pull the rug out from under them when the time was right. So the Battle of Grimbad commenced, and much of the plan went off without a hitch. The Crusader army poured forward while the Solianans moved underground, stuck down the cap blocks, and fought off the Leydish in a showy battle for their territory. Many of the Leyden warriors were not in on the plan, so when a couple of Crusaders foolishly ate glowberries that made them glow and gave away their underground position, Rapid Fire 323 and Alex is the Best started mocking them and told them to knock it off. But the plan went well for the deceitful allies. Leyden isolated and picked off many of the Crusader warriors, grabbing their weapons and armor. As the Solianans kept placing and defending their cap blocks underground, the Crusaders kept pouring forward in their enthusiasm, many of them respawning naked and running forward, where they kept being cut down by Leyden's PvPers. The battle ended after an hour, with an official score of 10-70. The Crusaders and Solianans having won their first battle together at Grimbad, as the Crusaders thought it would only take one more victory here at Grimbad to finish the job and annex the town for themselves, and hopefully this would put an end to the war entirely. The Solianans, eager to cement the Crusaders' trust in them, planned a second attack upon Leyden's little village of Grimbad. They told the Crusaders that they would take the town over themselves, not needing their help in this battle. So the Crusaders armed them with a dozen sets of war weapons and armor, and funded them them $300,000. The Solianans walked into the village of Grimbad, where they found a single Ladish player named Bodilov lounging there in a lawn chair watching them. Without the Crusaders watching, the Solianans didn't need to put on a show of fighting the Ladish, so they automatically won this mock battle, and the village of Grimbad was theirs to claim. But instead of giving it to the Crusaders or annexing it into their own empire, they handed it to an alt account of the Leyden player Hob0. So the Crusaders trusted the Solianans' war skills, yet this victory was only a mirage to prepare them for the knife that would stab them in the back. The Crusaders celebrated Soliana's victory over the village of Grimbad, holding a rally to praise the Crusaders and thank the Eternal for their destined victory in this war. However, something seemed a little off about all this. Soliana and Leyden had previously been allies, and Soliana was trying to offload as much of the Crusaders' war effort onto themselves at their own cost. Why? Would it not be helpful to have more people planning the war logistics and showing up to the battles? Even if Soliana had a lot more experience at war, surely the Crusaders could be helpful in their own defense. They were beginning to get a bit paranoid. But Soliana pressed on, secretly supporting Leyden. Hot on their perceived victory, Soliana convinced the Crusaders to open another front of the war. They wanted the Crusaders to strike the small, rebellious town of Riverdame, launching the attack from their capital city of Crusadon. If the Crusaders launched the attack from their capital, though, they would be putting it at risk of a counterattack. So they denied Soliana's advice and opted instead to use their large town called Sans Bibi Spurgo. The Solianan and Leyden leadership secretly convened and agreed that this city would do just fine. It was a large open area that was easy to attack, was pretty well populated and developed, and it was right at the geographical heart of the nation. So it was settled. The Crusaders could launch an attack on the tiny rebellious town. Soliana would pull the rug out from under them to immediately conquer their city of San Bibi Spurgo. The practice for Soliana was simple: direct the Crusaders to prepare for and fight this war as ineffectively as possible, and then right when the battle starts, turn on them, crush their forces, and immediately conquer the city. So, Soliana moved the Crusaders' war gear to their own private war storage and restocking facility. They told the Crusaders to build a big wall and dig tunnels under the entire town. They got them to pay $300,000 to Soliana to fight the war, this being split between their legendary warriors, the player Alex is the Best, and Sinister Asp. With these preparations, Soliana would be able to cut the Crusaders off from their resupplies for war gear, and they could let the Leyden army into the underground tunnels, which would make it easier for them to place and defend the all-important capture blocks. Soliana and Leyden would win the war, steal their gear, annex the heart of the Crusader Empire into Leyden, and smash their will to fight into pieces. There was only one problem: the opinion of one of the main PvPers here, Sinister Asp. Only a day or so before the battle was supposed to take place, he expressed disinterest in the plan. He was having a heated argument with one of Leyden's friends over the ownership of an elytra, which the Leyden leader Hob0 called extremely petty. So Sinister Asp kind of stepped back. Why would he care to give Leyden such a big win like this? In fact, he kind of felt bad for the Crusaders, being roped into their own downfall like this. So he signaled a radical shift to everyone else. He wouldn't participate in this plan unless he were given an extra $300,000? The Soliana and Leyden leaders refused. They must have thought that this kid was nuts. So instead, Sinister Asp sent out a call to a powerful mercenary group called Oculare, and he rallied a last-minute army of up to 80 mercenaries, who were willing to follow him in the genuine defense of the Crusader Empire. The Soliana and Leyden leaders began to panic, so they kicked Sinister Asp out of their channels for negotiating, and they moved the planned time for war at the very last second. This diffused Sinister Asp's rapid mercenary militarization, as they weren't able to gather quick enough at the new wartime. But this didn't mean that the mercenary warrior had to lay down and accept defeat. So Sinister Asp approached the Crusaders, who had hastily gathered together for the suddenly imminent battle. With only 15 minutes before the fight, he explained to them in great detail that Soliana had been entirely faking their part in this war, and they were about to commit one of the biggest imaginable treacheries upon the Crusaders. While the Crusaders were expecting to march to the little town of Riverdame and conquer it with Soliana's help, Soliana was really about to cut them off from all their war supplies and assist Leyden in assaulting their central city here of San Bibi Spurgo. This easy victory that they thought they had over Leyden was a farce. Instead, it was about to be a bloody struggle to the very last man for the soul of the Crusader Empire. And so approached the time for battle. The Crusaders were gathered in the town square of San Bibispergo, and with eyes reddened with the rage of betrayal, they recalibrated their strategy with Sinister Asp. Many of the warriors stood on the wall, waiting for the combined army of Leyden and Soliana to appear on the horizon. The open stone courtyards of the town were trampled by soldiers' diamond boots. The narrow alleyways between small citizen cottages were transformed into death zones with thorny berry bushes and cobwebs. The vibrant town had been locked down within a wall of patchwork gray stones, thrown and cobbled together as the final line of defense. The same wall that Soliana encouraged the Crusaders to build just to waste their time and energy. The bitterness among those at San Bibispergo was palpable in the air. But, however petty or flippant Sinister Asp's reason for turning on the rest of Leyden and Soliana, at least he was here to help them resist their treachery. The armies of Leyden and Soliana approached from the north, a horde of glistening diamond warriors filtering through the dark oak and birch forest onto the path and over the birch bridge across the river Leyden. The Crusader forces shot arrows upon them on their makeshift cobbled wall, while Sinister Asp dug down into the tunnels and cave under San Bibispergo to meet the invading host in the caverns where they would fight their battles. The Leydish and Solianans dug into the tunnels and immediately placed their first caps to take the outside edge of the town. Sinister Asp and the Crusaders attacked the crowd of invaders, but there were too many of them, and they were outnumbered and pushed off the cap, and the invaders captured their first chunk of San Bibispergo. The battle poured out into the tunnels underneath the town, the diamond warriors stabbing and prodding at each other in narrow stone and dirt caverns, like biting and ripping ants stepping over each other in their colonies. The invaders placed another cap block, but the Crusaders fought them up the cave walls, and Sinister Asp dropped TNT that exploded to break it. But around them in other tunnels, the invaders had spawned an Elder Guardian and blocked off sections of the cave, so the Crusaders were all afflicted with mining fatigue, and they were trapped out of these tunnels. So they placed TNT and blew through them, but a swarm of invaders met them at the barrier and cut them down as they attempted to reach the capped block. The fighting beneath and around San Bibispergo raged on, but the armies began to thin out and scatter. The Crusaders had been tricked into giving away their war supplies to Soliana, and the Leyden-Soliana forces were growing massively frustrated at the resistance when they expected an easy, overwhelming win. Sinister Asp was able to get behind the Leyden and Solianan armies and tried to place another cap block on the territory they had already captured, but he was again outnumbered by the crowd in the tunnels, and so he was pushed back, and his counter cap was unsuccessful. When the fighting died down, after the Crusaders faced dozens of casualties and the invading Leyden-Soliana forces had exhausted themselves, it was clear that the defensive battle had been lost. Leyden and Soliana now occupied the streets of San Bibispergo, and they had the last man standing on the battlefield. But Sinister Asp and the Crusaders had put up a fight that they did not expect, for they thought they were going to be able to immediately capture this city, squash the isolated Crusader resistance like a bug, and then break up the rest of the country. But Sinister Asp's betrayal of their plan made that impossible, and so the forces of Leyden and Soliana were discouraged, and they pulled their troops out of San Bibispergo. Where did this leave Leyden? They had been planning with Soliana for months on how to gain the Crusaders' trust and trick them into screwing up this war, but Sinister Asp's betrayal of their plan threw a giant wrench into the entire thing. The Crusaders now knew that Soliana was working against them. Sinister Asp had shown that he didn't care, and the Crusaders now had a strength and resolve to get revenge on those who had tricked and planned to betray them. Oscar 105 and Warmpia met together in Leyden and had a difficult conversation, but it was clear, if they decided to continue this fight, they would be forced to fight multiple battles for each little town in the Crusader Empire, which would be incredibly draining on their resources, time, energy, and the nation's attention. It just wasn't worth it. And so Leyden ended their imperialist war. The Kingdom of Leyden said that they would give back all 3 land claims that rebelled, although they only gave back one of them, and they pulled out of the war. Their scheme to rope in and betray the Crusaders did not work, simply because one of Soliana's PvPers had betrayed it. How ironic. And so, as always, the Crusaders celebrated their resistance against Leyden and Soliana with a patriotic service in their cathedral. When things died down and became peaceful again, it was business as usual. The Crusaders funded larger and larger construction projects, held more services at their church, and kept bickering about petty issues in the Empire. However, over the next few weeks, their recent enemies in Soliana ascended as the core of a powerful union of states, a diverse empire led by grizzled military strategists called Solj. Solj used a lot of rash threats and bullying in their diplomacy, particularly against their smaller neighbors like the Crusaders. A faraway player named Kekyoin Ramsay noticed these troubles, and so he invited them to appeal to his own experienced leader in the Empire of Valera. The Crusaders told the Valerans of their persistent troubles, that Saladin, whom they had just resisted in a war, still held threatening ambitions of subjugating them. The Valeran Emperor Haname YT and Duke Kekyoin Ramsay looked at their situation with sympathy. They saw the Crusader Empire as an energetic but vulnerable roleplay community. The aggressive military nation of Solj, having heard of Valera's talks with the Crusaders, threatened them to back off. They even tried to get the Crusaders to join them instead of Valera, but the Crusaders thought about if they wanted to join this bullying empire, and they refused. This only strengthened the Valerans' resolve, so they accepted the Crusaders as a protected vassal in their commonwealth. As these nations engaged in high-level geopolitical maneuvers, the Crusader leaders Alec and Bibi were engaging in some shenanigans. They stole tens of thousands of dollars worth of loot out of the main castle in Crusadon, and they gambled it away at a nearby casino, specifically on a game where you flip a coin against another bettor. Alec and Bibi claimed this loss to be about $60,000, whereas Luca FSB claimed it to be $300,000. This sparked a big argument where Alec and Bibi laid out their criticisms of Luca's leadership. They accused him of being power hungry, not giving credit to people who did work under him, not communicating with his government members, and wasting the nation's resources on bad, unvetted plans. And during all this fighting, Folded Celery, as the Machiavellian politician that he is, convinced Bibi to say that he should take the throne and be the emperor instead of Luca. So Luca took this argument as a contest to his power, and so he exiled him and renamed the historic city of San Bibi Spurgo to Eternalsburg, announcing, "My son and diplomat has betrayed his father and wants to take his throne, after also having taken all the treasury of the imperial castle to gamble, and having deceived others from following the legitimate owner of Crusadon. BB1 used his position as a diplomat of the Crusaders Empire to turn our own allies against us, and to give fake information to nations, trying to deceive them and invite them to further destabilize the continent of Halen." To which Bibi responded with his own biting criticisms. "I am called greedy and referred to as traitor, even though I and many now banished players often donated my own time and energy for the greater good of the nation. If being a traitor means suggesting for Luca to abdicate the throne to someone more fit because he is not active anymore and the numerous amounts of mistakes made by him, then I am guilty. The Emperor has been the cause of all our problems, from the hostile relations with our neighbors to the unjustified purges which made a rebellion break out, and he, with his way of leadership, is the reason we cannot defend ourselves. We all opposed Milty's rebellion some time ago because back then we still believed in Luca's leadership. But maybe Milty was right after all." Within the next week, the players of Saladin had been reconsidering their strategy for dealing with the Crusader Empire to their south. If they could not directly annex them by conquest, maybe they could coerce them into a more intimate relationship that they could take advantage of. As Saladin began scheming again, Solj barraged the Crusaders with geopolitical threats. The Crusaders, even now as vassals of Valera, felt extremely vulnerable in this position. Saladin took advantage of this and schemed. If they could connect with the Crusaders and slowly gain their trust over time, at a certain point, they would give them access to a lot of permissions in their internal land claims and Discord, which they could use to swipe their cities. So Luca FSB and DuperKnight met with the Saladin leaders Wyrmpia and Hobbs Zero, and they came to an agreement. The Crusaders would leave Valera and unite with Saladin. There would be one large kingdom run by a council of players, with Luca and Wyrmpia as the diarchs executing their diplomacy and the council's will. The Crusaders would get to keep all their culture and identity, as long as they both unified under Wyrmpia's preferred new name of Reynarte. The former enemies shook hands and united into a new kingdom that, under different circumstances, could have been a superpower in the central lands of the continent. Haname YT hung his head in disappointment, while the banished players Alec and Bibi looked upon this union with disgust. It only took a few days for things to start unraveling, though. Luca FSB chafed a lot with the co-equal diarch, and he told the Leyden leaders and Crusaders that he should be the sole king of the realm. Not only that, but the Crusader mayors were suspicious of the Leyden players that now walked among them, as they'd proven sly and treacherous in the battles that they'd fought weeks before. And to their credit, they were right that this was the long-term goal of Leyden's leaders. There was clearly discontent among the players, who privately complained about Luca's questionable decision to merge their proud country with the treacherous Leydish, especially since Luca went rather inactive at this time. And because Luca usually ran the capital city of Crusadon, the Crusader nation was now being unofficially run by DuperKnight out of his city, the acting capital of Crusaden. The Valeran Emperor Haname YT visited the city of Crusaden and appealed to the leaders there, pointing out that Leyden's evil allies and soldiers were still threatening the good people in this region, and that the Crusaders knew better than to trust these scheming people. So Alec and Bibi stepped back into the Crusader lands to silently organize a plan with the unhappy mayors. Bibi used his diplomatic connections to get a meeting with the leaders of a powerful nation called Centaura, but they rejected his bid to become their vassals. However, they returned back to Valera and sought to join back up with them, but there was a catch now. The Valeran Emperor and the vassal Duke Kekyoin Ramsay would now have to be appointed as chancellors on the Supreme Council of the Crusaders, and they wanted access to see the private Discord communication channels so that they could now keep an eye on them and stop them from making stupid decisions. Alec agreed to this, as he was still angry at Emperor Luca for kicking him out and starting this whole Reynarte mess in the first place. So Alec and Bibi met with the de facto leader DuperKnight, and he joined in on their plan to abandon the union with Leyden. So they coordinated with the Crusader mayors to spring a revolution, and at noon, only 10 days after the union started, the three Crusaders led everyone to join back into the original Crusaders nation claim, and they officially split from Reynarte. Alec and Bibi rejoined the Empire, and Luca returned to joyfully announce that they had drafted a new constitution that liberated them from Reynarte tyranny, to rejoin the more enlightened Commonwealth under Valera. As the Crusaders settled into a well-earned political peace under Valera, there began a global resurgence of an ancient religion called Gonfism. The figure of Gonf was not tied to the Crusaders' religion by any means, but he was a crucified preacher whose execution caused a crusade against an evil empire, so it's all rather aligned with the religion of the Crusaders. They were pleased to see that some people around the world were shedding their pagan ways and embracing a similar devotion to their own. However, during this, there arose a great new enemy, a player of inverted dark green and blue colors who used evil magic to fly, disguise himself as other people, summon lightning, unleash monsters, and harass the righteous believers of the world, the Anti-Gonf. Anti-Gonf struck at the faithful cities around the world. His vitriolic words and spiteful destruction inspired a movement of followers among the restless and angry players of Abexilas. The player Tanner M270 would lead them in sacrifices around a bloody altar, praying to the demonic forces for the promised vengeful salvation. As they spoke their words to the evil abomination, the forces of his black magic rewarded their loyalty with great riches and powers, and they set out to attack the faithful of the world as well. Anti-Gonf first appeared to the Crusaders in the castle, to the Emperor and some military guards. They were curious about this flying blue player until he denounced the Eternal as a false god, and declared himself the bringer of salvation through selfish greed, chaos, and darkness. The Crusaders attacked him with their swords and spears, but he spawned undead abominations that overwhelmed them in the castle. As they fought here, he summoned a meteor upon the capital temple which held their nation's sacred central fire, and obliterated it into a crater of scorched stone, planting a corrupted seed of evil in the ground of the city before flying away. The Crusader Pope at this time, Pope Dane, immediately held a council with many of the nation's leaders and warriors. Here, he called for the Crusaders to follow their sacred duty and finally go on a crusade. The call was met with shouts of overwhelming agreement, so they formed together as the Brotherhood of Light, and the Emperor announced to the public, "The creature called Anti-Gonf is bringing chaos and devastation wherever he sets foot. A cult is growing made of followers of the demon. He is a damned fallen creature, something that needs to be burned. The Anti-Gonfists are enemies of the Eternal. They are the enemy of God. We will crush their towns. We will set fire to their houses. What they call home will be turned to dust. Join the Holy Crusade, become a Crusader, and fight by my side in glory under the light of the Almighty. This was the united sentiment of all the Crusaders, except for one, who had previously suffered under the sway of the malevolent Fasak, who had the seed of corruption planted by the Chedabrefito disease and was never fully cured. The former king called Arthur Crusaden DuperKnight. As the son of Emperor Luca FSB, who was briefly the sole king, then a power-sharing diarch, then an overshadowed prince by his father's returning, the promises of Anti-Gonf were too enticing to him. So in his private quarters, he secretly practiced this new religion in pursuit of power, and he sent private letters back and forth to other Anti-Gonfists across the world. A dark flower was blooming within him that pulled this otherwise good prince toward greed and darkness. As the Crusaders organized their crusade, Tanner M270 formalized Anti-Gonf's church as a religion called Athoism, and in the vengeful cultists' thirst for blood and chaos, they launched a sudden nighttime raid upon Crusadon. Under the moonlight, they snuck in and murdered the livestock in their pens and civilians in their homes, collecting the blood of the innocent and righteous to use in their rituals and to present to the Anti-Gonf. Anti-Gonf took it and blessed it for the preacher Tanner and his followers to drink, and he flew to Crusadon himself. The despairing Crusaders saw Anti-Gonf fly in over their walls and shot arrows at him.
But Anti-Gonf deflected these arrows and taunted the Crusaders. They fought for a fake god, he said. They were enslaved by authoritarian abusers whom they had been trained to love. He turned to the sky dark and mocked them, saying that the only way forward was to turn against the codes that had been forced upon them, to liberate themselves by plotting to destroy the oppressive world of man, just as their friends were doing in secret. But the Crusaders did not listen to Anti-Gonf, and they hurled arrows and insults at him. Anti-Gonf then split into two images and attacked them with barrages of lightning before disappearing into the wind. The present Crusaders were deeply offended, so they set about preparing weapons and armor for battle, and sent spies of the Crusader Security Bureau to watch the followers of Anti-Gonf in their faraway city of Kenamek. Later, the spies reported that the Anti-Gonfists would be performing a ritual that night, so the Crusaders sailed to the town of Kenamek, and they waited on the other side of a nearby hill.
Tanner M270 had gathered the Anti-Gonfists, and was preaching about the greatness of darkness and what others call sin overshadowing the weak and fragile gods of the righteous worshippers. When the satanic congregation was deep in prayer to the demonic Anti-Gonf, the Crusaders blew their horn and charged from the hill down upon them. They cut through the Anti-Gonfist worshippers where they stood, spilling their blood on the offensive books and symbols, but the preacher Tanner M270 escaped and fled with some followers to a dark cave underwater. Marco stepped forward upon the empty altar and proclaimed this battle as the victorious First Crusade. But while their slaughter here was successful and Anti-Gonf's Athoists were scattered, the threat still lurked as they plotted true revenge. When the Crusaders returned from their crusade back to Crusadon, they took a moment to think together on where they were and what they had accomplished. In their relations with other states, they had finally settled into a peaceful status quo. The Commonwealth of Valera was growing over time into a powerful political and military force, which would keep them stable and grounded in international politics. They now had a diplomatic web of competent allies that could advise them, gather international intelligence, and stand up for them in the face of bellicose threats, especially since the aggressive state of Solj would always be there trying to bully and extort them. They had been offered to join Solj against Valera, but no, they could stand proud with their allies, fighting for the right side against difficult odds. They had also grown mature enough to stabilize their government. As Luca was away during the past negotiations with Valera, the Crusaders had prepared a new system of power and accountability. It wouldn't just be the Emperor and his royal family. Now there would be a council of trusted members of the government, appointed as chancellors. The Valerans sat on this council, as did Bibi, the Chancellor of Diplomacy, Alec, the Chancellor of War, and later Marco, the Chancellor of Culture. Luca would still be the Emperor, the central pillar of stately and cultic power, but everyone recognized that his strengths laid with the spirit of the nation, and his hand was rightfully steadied in leadership by his Council of Chancellors. Luca would ensure that the council had the power and authority to do what they needed to do, and the council would ensure that the emperor would motivate the citizens forward in all their national projects. A new grandiose castle, military exercises, a brand new university, and feasts and festivals. The sun rose upon Crusadon after its first crusade, and they celebrated being their own people. So all together here in Crusadon, they raised a glass to their union and triumphs over the trials they've endured. They had grown strong enough to take on new ventures, finding the experience and confidence that would eventually bring them to strengthen military alliances abroad, to gain vassals on the central continent of Talassi to become an overseas colonial empire, and to negotiate a friendly independence from Valera. But for now, the Crusaders could finally sit down and relish a joyous meal together as friends. On an ordinary market day in peaceful Crusadon, when people from all over the state and region would come to trade goods and attend a service at the central cathedral, the ground began to rumble. The crater where the devastating and fiery meteor had previously struck the town square began to crack open the stone floor around it. Out of the ground grew a huge tower like a mountain, surrounded by ghasts and topped with a massive watching eye of Ender. Antigomp devilishly emerged from behind it and began to strike down the innocent people below. The Crusaders rose in defense of their city, showering Antigomp and his tower with their blades and arrows, but he flew around and summoned undead creatures to attack and distract them. During the fighting, Emperor Luca Ebesby charged at Antigomp with his blade in an attempt to strike him down, but Antigomp grabbed him and put him in the cage in front of his tower. DuperKnight, the son of Luca and the only follower of Antigomp among the Crusaders, saw this and ran to the cage, attempting to break through it to free his father. Antigomp watched on for several minutes as DuperKnight attempted to free his emperor, and Antigomp taunted him with how useless and stupid he was for this. The fighting in the town square began to die down, and the Crusaders watched this harsh exchange between this devil and his own follower, until DuperKnight shouted that he would give his life for his emperor if he had to. Antigomp paused, and in curiosity, he told DuperKnight that if he was really choosing to betray his faithful allegiance just for this little king, then he would die right where he stood. After a pause, DuperKnight said yes. He chooses his father and his country. So Antigomp reached out his hand, and he obliterated DuperKnight. The crowd of Crusaders gasped and watched as DuperKnight's soul stepped out of the ruins of his body. But the righteous figure of Gomf himself descended from above to grab the hand of DuperKnight's spirit, and they ascended together to the heavenly realm of the Eternal, being hidden in the sky by oncoming rain clouds. Antigomp flew away and disappeared in rejection, and never again did this malevolent agent harm the righteous people of Abexilas. This was the triumph of DuperKnight over the selfish darkness of Antigomp, that he chose his people and his family over the ambitious corruption within him, and was canonized for his sacrifice as Saint Arthur Crusaden. Thanks for watching, subscribe and leave a comment, and join our server at play.stoneworks.gg.